Before she became one of the world's leading epidemiologists, Devra Davis was a victim of environmental pollution. As a young girl in Donora, Pennsylvania, she saw 20 members of her hometown community and family die, and scores afflicted with lifelong injuries in the smog disaster of October 1948. In her new book, When Smoke Ran Like Water, Tales of Environmental Deception and the Battle Against Pollution, Davis merges her personal experience and scientific expertise to argue for fundamentally new ways of thinking about our health and the environment. Formerly a scholar in residence at the National Academy of Sciences and member of the National Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board under President Clinton, Devra Davis is now visiting professor of public policy at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz School and senior advisor to the World Health Organization. Dr. Davis is a graduate of the Public Schools of Pittsburgh and the University of Pittsburgh. She holds her PhD from the University of Chicago. She holds her PhD from the University of Chicago and an MPH from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Devra Davis.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and I want to thank you all for coming out for this lovely evening here in Cambridge in the midst of what has been a very challenging winter for lots of reasons for many of us. I'm going to start by reading some things from my book, When Smoke Ran Like Water. I will invite you to look at the website, whensmokeranlikewater.com. It has more information. And then we'll have a chance to talk about some of the issues that we've raised here. I begin with a story of ancient history. My Bubby Fanny loved what we Western Pennsylvanians call roller coasters. Every year, the entire family joined our small town's annual expedition to Kennywood Park near Pittsburgh to ride some of the best coasters in the country. Think about this. The entire town left. Houses were not robbed. We all went off to the amusement park. I loved the thrill of sitting securely next to my large, soft grandmother while being dragged slowly upward, and then whooshing down so fast you simply had to scream to breathe. Once when I was 5, as we staggered off the famous jackrabbit with its double-dip drop, Bubby Fanny brought me over to greet her cousin Sadie. She said to Sadie proudly in Yiddish, "This is my granddaughter. She's a little devil with a big mouth." Though Bubby had bragged about my ability to speak, I could not. Sadie had arrived a few months earlier from Europe, where everyone's relatives seemed to come from, and had been the subject of conversations I barely understood. Still flushed and breathless from the ride, I found myself facing a strangely silent, ghost-like woman. I don't remember if I even looked at her face. My eyes went to her forearm. On her freckled skin were some faded blue numbers, a bit deeper than the USDA stamps on the meat my mother used to buy from the butcher. Following my gaze, my grandmother said, "Tell her, Sadie. Tell her what this means." I will never know what Sadie felt then, less than 5 years out of the concentration camps, standing there amid the Calliope music and the screams of children, like all those with tattooed numbers on their bodies. She was immune from ever having to talk about what she had lived through. She said nothing. I go on to describe the stories and experiences of my friend Deb Filler, who, as a bonding experience, went with her father, who'd been a Holocaust survivor, on a whirlwind tour of European death camps. Everybody comfortable? And as they were on this tour, one of the tour guides began saying, about 20,000 people left Auschwitz to march here. A lot of them survived. The Germans kept meticulous records on everyone who ever came here. Here was the torture chamber. Much to the woman's surprise, my friend's father, Saul, objected. Excuse me, that's not true. How could you say such a thing? Nobody was writing down the numbers. I came here from Auschwitz with only 200. We started with 90,000. We were eating grass along the way. Nobody was counting the bodies. For 3 days we sat in this cell with no food. Bodies were all around us. If I had died here, nobody would have known. The Holocaust was one of the great unmentioned shadows of my childhood. The other was pollution. The two are not morally comparable. If by mentioning them together I seem to equate them, reader, please be assured that is not my intention, and I understand the differences. Unlike the Nazis' infamous killing machines, with their explicit plans and strategies of humiliation and murder, the sources of death and injury from pollution cannot easily be pinned down. The damages tied with our environment arise not from some deliberate effort to purify society against a perceived enemy within, but from the daily activities of people doing productive work. But in my family and in my community, the environment and the Holocaust had one thing in common. Both subjects were so grim and hard to stomach that they were not fit for normal conversation. The Talmud says, whoever saves a single life, it is as if she has saved the entire world. Like my friend Dev's father, Saul, I've come to believe that it is a moral necessity that each fate be counted. We cannot change the past, but we can and must bear witness so that the future may be different. It makes no difference whether we are remembering millions or a few felled by a hidden local epidemic. Those of us who survive must enumerate, count, tally, and measure what has happened. We must record and pass on the truth. So I begin with the stories as a child of how enchanting it was to grow up in a town that had great hills for sliding down. I was a bit of a tomboy. And I only learned years later that the reason you could slide down so many hills in Donora was because the fumes killed the grass and things didn't grow there very well. Donora was the kind of place where an adventurous 3-year-old like my brother Marty could wander 5 miles away from home and never really be lost. He made front-page headlines both times he did it. Runaway Marty does it again. Read the second one. Each time, somebody brought him back up the steep hills around the curvy, slag-lined, coal-paved roads back to our house. It was the kind of town where, for fun, we would sit out back with lawn chairs and watch them top off the blast furnace at night. It was a wonderful thing to have homegrown fireworks and fumes and sparks would spew and light up the sky for miles around. People would stop their cars to watch because it was such an awesome sight. Well, in the 1950s, the mills began to shut down and Donora became a place to leave. Nobody spoke about what was happening. I don't have to read this next part. It's emblazoned in my brain and heart. I went away to the University of Pittsburgh to school, and I came home one day, and I said to my mother, "Mom, was there another town with the same name as ours?" And she got kind of quiet. And she said, "Why do you ask?" I said, "Well, I read in a book at school that a town called Donora was polluted. Was there another Donora?" I actually thought she was going to tell me that there was. You know, there's a couple Pittsburghs, a couple Allentowns. She got kind of quiet. And she motioned for me to sit down. I knew this was not going to be an easy conversation. And she sighed and she finally said, "Well, nobody knew from pollution then. That was just the way it was. We didn't think much about it." Then she reminded me about how, because I was a tall child, I got to help scrub the walls down about once a month. And the cars would drive with the headlights on in the fall. And she said, "Well, I guess today they might call it pollution, but back then it was just a living." That was kind of an amazing thing for me. But at that time, she didn't even tell me what had happened in Donora. I only learned years later that in one 12-hour period, because the fumes and smoke from the mills didn't clear from the valley, 18 people dropped dead in this young, healthy town full of steel workers and football players. In the book, I describe how nothing ever interfered with football in Donora, and the game went on even though the players could not see each other, and when the ball went up in the air, they couldn't see the ball either. But nothing interfered with football in Donora. It was a strong, hardy town. Well, people in Donora weren't too keen to know what had happened, and they readily seized upon the explanation that it had been an act of God, a freak of bad weather, and right away the mill switched from burning coal in many areas to burning natural gas. 2 months later, a study began. 2 months after the air had cleared, they came in to study what had happened to Donora. There was never a final report, and there never will be. But growing up in Donora was wonderful. One got to appreciate the massive efforts that went into steelmaking, which really is an amazing thing to behold. I'll read you one passage about what it was like to watch coal-laden barges as they snaked up the curvy river. Along the Donora side of the river, we could watch the barges rising through the intricate system of locks. Huge metal gates would open. The giant vessel would slowly move inside, as if being swallowed by some gigantic whale, and then the gates would bellow with the crunching, creaking, groaning sounds of metal on metal as they majestically swept shut. The captain would tie up to the side of the lock with oily, blackened hawsers as thick as my leg, crossing them at bow and stern. The lockmaster and barge captain would wave a thumbs up, and hundreds of thousands of gallons of muddy river water would surge into the lock. Then, with a movement that never ceased to amaze us, the ship would gradually inch upward, as though lifted by some phantom force, until it could float out the other side and continue its journey to the mills. So, Donora was a wonderful place to grow up for a child. I loved the spectacular showers of sparks and sprawling fires that lit up the sky for miles, glowing with dusts and gases from the furnace. It was a fiercely hypnotic sight. I only learned years later what it had meant for people's health. In fact, I was a precocious child, and I loved the fact that I could always find my grandmother at home, and that her bedroom smelled of chicken soup. I only learned years later why that was the case. You see, she had a heart attack during this smog but didn't die then. And her bedroom became what had once been the dining room. So she was always there and always in bed, and there was a huge oxygen tank in the corner. And she had so many heart attacks that I could remember watching them and always expecting that she would survive them. The attacks were so common that they became almost a ritual. The room would go quiet, and my mother, the baby of the family, would steady her own mother by the arm and steer her to the bed. The heavy mottled green steel oxygen tank would be wheeled over, the valve turned on, and the gas mask pulled over Bubby's nose and mouth. Her skin often matched the blue-white color of her hair. Aunt Gert, the oldest sister, always had to leave the room, unable to stand by helplessly while her mother fought for air. Sometimes Bubby would shriek, "Oy vey," but usually there was silence and sighing. We would all wait for Dr. Levin. Dr. Levin always came, always calm, always sure. His arrival meant that everything would be all right. The night she finally died, he did not come. I could not stop crying. I had seen her nearly die so many times. I was sure it was a mistake. People thought Donora had been a fluke, an act of God, a freak of nature. And the town wasn't particularly interested in finding out whether there had been any relationship between the fumes of the coke ovens and the steel mills and the rolling mills and the zinc plants and what happened in the town. But 4 years later, something hit London, and I talk about that in my chapter, The Phantom Epidemic. London had been famous for fogs for years. This passage from Dickens: "It was a foggy day in London, and the fog was heavy and dark. Animate London with smarting eyes and irritated lungs was blinking, wheezing, and choking. Inanimate London was a sooty specter, divided in purpose between being visible and invisible, and so being wholly neither." That's Dickens. Well, artists loved the smog of London and found it fascinating. Dickens wrote about it. Sherlock Holmes escaped into it regularly. Monet actually came at the turn of the century and painted more than 90 different scenes of the smog of London. And he wrote in his notebooks, which I describe in my book, how he loved the dazzling refraction of light. I invite you to squint as you look at me right now. Just squint. there you have Impressionism. And he was able to enjoy the refraction of the particles, the diffraction of the light created by the smoke. So it was celebrated. And the British, of course, have always prided themselves on their stiff upper lips, but they didn't have stiff upper lungs. And that became apparent in 1952 when, during 5 days, an inversion of coal smoke from the million chimneys that were burning coal in homes in London at the time sat like a lid on the pot over the Thames Valley and didn't move. And those same conditions settled over London. And within 2 weeks, there had been 4,000 deaths more than normal. Now, the government was struggling at this time. Britain, as some of you know, was recovering from incredible debts and trauma of the last war to have been fought in Britain so far. And there was rationing of horse meat, and there was rationing of sweets. The last thing the Conservative government could consider was the idea that they'd have to have more expensive fuels burned in their homes. Harold Macmillan complained that everybody expects the government to solve all their problems nowadays, and in a memo that I found and report on my book, said, ridiculous as it seems, let's form a committee. We can't do very much, but we can seem to be very busy, and that's half the battle nowadays. We can also hand out some of those masks. He knew that smog masks would be useless, but nonetheless they were handed out. And there was, of course, a committee that reviewed the situation, and they reached a conclusion very quickly because they had some reports that there had been flu in the area. Well, there's always flu at this time of year in every major city of the world. But the official government explanation fastened on this very quickly and officially declared that any death that occurred later in December would officially be called due to flu. And effectively, this meant that there was no record of any deaths associated possibly with the smog. My colleague, Dr. Michelle Bell of Johns Hopkins University, and I have done an analysis of the records of the day, hospital records, and looking at the practice of an astute clinician who kept records for 20 years. And we've shown that there was no massive flu epidemic at that time. In fact, what happened then was that the death rate from the London smog remained elevated well into the end of February. And as a consequence, we calculated that there were 12,000 more deaths than would have occurred otherwise after the London smog. Now, some of you may be aware of a mural that's at 110 Church Street. Anyone here seen it? Well, I'd like to tell you a little bit about that and tell you a little bit about Bella Abzug next. Bella Abzug was quite an amazing woman. And the phone rang so early one Sunday morning at my house, I thought it had to be bad news or a wrong number. And a voice boomed through the receiver. This is Bella. My friends are dropping like flies. I'm going to have a hearing at City Hall on breast cancer and environment, March 20th. I want you to be there. Now, I'd never met the woman, but I recognized that voice. I can't do justice to it. And I didn't quite know why was she calling me about all of this. She didn't have the disease, but like many in the mid-1990s, she was enraged by what was happening to her friends. She was scandalized by the growing number of treatment failures and missed diagnosis and the unacceptably shabby medical care for poor women. During her childhood, 1 in 40 women developed breast cancer. By the time she was student body president at Hunter College and editor-in-chief of the Law Review at Columbia University, the rate was 1 in 20. Now in her 70s, Bella wanted to know why breast cancer attacked 1 in 9 women by age 85. Well, when Aldo Leopold wrote, "We all strive for safety, prosperity, comfort, long life, and dullness," he could not have been imagining Bella. She was a woman who consistently defied the status quo, and she did not hesitate to lash out at those who followed her if she thought them lacking sufficient zeal or commitment. Given the way Bella treated her friends, I was glad not to be among her enemies. Like many things Bella started, the campaign to find the environmental causes of breast cancer continues without her. I can't resist sharing with you this little experience I had. I was with her in Beijing at the Women's Conference, pushing her around in a wheelchair, along with others. And at that point, former President George Bush made the mistake of attacking her participation in the Beijing meeting to reporters covering his own trip to Japan, where he was collecting a hefty lecture fee. I feel sorry for the Chinese having Bella Abzug run around there, he told Newsweek magazine. He did not know that Bella was basically confined to a wheelchair, ordering those of us who took turns pushing her to be snappy about it. She deadpanned a reply to Bush that also made it into Newsweek. He was speaking before a fertilizer convention. How appropriate. Today, Bella's portrait can be found on a large wall just up the street here at 110 Church Street. The Women's Community Cancer Project secured permission from the Cambridge Zoning Commission to use the side of the Lowe's Theater, here we are, as the site of a major mural by B. Sargent. It was completed in 1998, and the colorful painting features 12 women who lost their lives to the disease at that time, including Rachel Carson, biologist and author of Silent Spring, Audre Lorde, black feminist poet, cancer activist and author of the Cancer Journals, and Myra Sadker, advocate for gender equality in education, and 9 local women ranging in age from 30 to 70, Maria Luisa Alvarez, Agnes Barboza, Cindy Chin, Valerie Hindley, Jean Marie Marshall, Esther Rachel Rome, Susan Shapira, Jacqueline Shearer, and Thelma Vanderhoop Weisberg. It feels a little funny to find my small portrait on the side of this building, but I'm in really grand company. The entire piece is bordered with bright black, red, and yellow symbols of some common sources of cancer-causing agents ranging from dirty air and water and dangerous workplaces to pesticides, radiation, and toxic household products and wastes. Across the bottom of the painting is written, "Indication of harm, not proof of harm, is our call to action." Bella would have loved this as well. We all know that death is a part of life. It's a little bit of a stretch here, but I want to read you about the celebration of Bella's funeral. She and I had spent some time talking about the fact that life would end, and she challenged my belief in eternal life. I think it's fitting here in a church for me to admit I believe in eternal life. But as a scientist, I can't prove it. On the other hand, it's a source of enormous comfort to me. And she challenged me, and she said, "What makes you so sure there's anything after we die?" And I said, "Bella, what makes you so strong in the face of such pain? What forces you to spend your days struggling with us here? Why don't you just go off to Florida and play mahjong? Can it be anything other than the souls of all those who have gone before you?" And she replied, "I'm not so sure about all those souls, but I know my mother is still very proud of me." Actually, a line that isn't in the book, at one point, Bella's mother really had enormous confidence in her, and as you may know, she was the first person in Congress to oppose the war. And her mother at one point said to her, "Bella, you've been against the war a long time. How come it's not over yet?" Well, at her funeral, it became quite a celebration of her gritty determination. The young woman rabbi presiding over the funeral somberly intoned, "If heaven ever were male-dominated," she paused and looked upward, "we know things are changing right now." And that brought down the house. And then Shirley MacLaine, known for her efforts to communicate across time and space with those long gone from the earth, began her remarks looking directly at the coffin. I, of course, will speak directly to Bella. She turned to address the casket to her left and continued, "Bella, you always said you were a feminist, but I know you were basically a humanist." MacLaine stretched the middle syllable. At that moment, the microphone, which stood like that, several feet away, from any living soul fell off its stand. The crowd gasped. Okay, Bella. I was just kidding. Well, we want to have time for questions, so I want to just switch now to a brief discussion of the issues of climate and warming, as we are now committed to continuing to burn fossil fuels in the way that we do. But before doing that, I want to share with you some of the observations from wildlife that I think are should be a subject of more public attention than they are thus far. You know, there's a lot of debate about whether we have proof of human harm in a number of areas. But there's not much debate about what's happening to the beluga whales of the St. Lawrence River estuary in Canada, the polar bears of the Arctic, and roadkill in the Bitterroot Forest of Montana. And I'm going to talk to you briefly about that. Normally, wild animals rarely, if ever, get cancer, and the rate at which they have ambiguous genitals is also believed to be extremely rare. The rate of cancer in the St. Lawrence beluga whales is higher than in any population of wildlife ever studied right now, occurring in nearly 1 in 5 carcasses autopsied since 1985. The levels of persistent PCBs and other organochlorines found in these whales would qualify them as toxic waste. In 1998, scientists on Svalbard, an Arctic island off Finland, reported that more than 1 out of every 100 polar bears was hermaphroditic, having genitals that were both male and female. The bears are not alone. Ted Kerstetter is a zoologist, just retired from Humboldt State University. He now works with Friends of the Bitterroot Valley between Hamilton and Stephenville, Montana, tracking some bizarre patterns. Chinook salmon of the last free-flowing stretch of the Columbia River of the Pacific Northwest and fish in other regions are showing up with both male and female sex organs. 3 out of every 4 fish look female, and the males are just not genetically normal. It ain't very pretty, Kerstetter noted. Judy Hoy grew up on a farm milking cows day and night and has the arm muscles to show for it. She runs a licensed wildlife rehabilitation facility in the Bitterroot, using roadkill to feed injured owls, eagles, coyotes, abandoned baby bears, and other rescued carnivores. In 1995, Hoy began to keep records of what looked like increasing numbers of deformities showing up in the genitals of dead male deer. With Kerstetter, she published an article confirming that there was this increase in these deformities. Nobody knows what's causing these deformities, but aerial spraying for weeds in the region has also increased during this same time. No official study is underway, nor is any contemplated by state authorities. All this sexual confusion in wildlife probably is not good for us either. How can we be sure, in a world that's constantly changing, what it may mean? How do we know what normal private parts should look like in roadkill? Perhaps we are just getting better at finding strange things, but the alternative explanation that something more serious is going on cannot be rejected. We are surely different from deer and whales and polar bears, but we may not be different enough. I'll conclude with a few passages in my discussion on issues of global warming. I want to let you know, before I do that, about a ranch in Crawford, Texas. This is a ranch that uses recycled wastewater, passive solar design, has a heat pump, and it consumes 1/3 less energy than a comparable house. It was designed 5 years ago by Laura and George W. Bush. It's an interesting point, is it not? That they can choose to have a home that is green and energy efficient for themselves. And we, in the government and policies that we're pursuing now, are not making those choices as a country. Just to make it clear that the things that were burned in Donora and London are with us even now, I will conclude with this passage describing my own expedition to Mauna Loa, which is a 14,000-foot volcano in the middle of the Pacific Ocean where records of carbon dioxide have been kept for the past 4 decades. I once climbed to the top of the 400-foot-high monitoring tower on Mauna Loa. I exhaled gently into the system. That day, the air I inhaled could well have contained contaminants smaller than 2 microns that had been tracked from specific smokestacks in Beijing, thousands of miles away. The stratosphere 9 miles above me undoubtedly contained molecules from the exhaust of some of those 1973 Fords that Lee Iacocca said would be hard to improve on, as well as carbon dioxide molecules released by coal stoves in London in 1952 and steel mills and the zinc plant in Donora in 1948. My exhaled breath joined the millions of tons of carbon dioxide created in Donora more than 50 years ago, ending up as part of the upper stratosphere, adding insulating weight to the growing amount of warming materials now swirling around the planet. As some of you may know, religious groups are leading the way now by forming partnerships on the environment, the National Religious Partnership on the Environment, the Coalition of Organizations on the Environment and Jewish Life. They have even created entertaining teaching tools for the candle-ridden holiday of Hanukkah called Let There Be Renewable Light. I think these are all welcome developments, and I would invite you to look at my book and to talk with me about what are some of the other things we can do to see that the world remains more sustainable in the future than it is now. Thank you very much.
You are joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Devra Davis discussing When Smoke Ran Like Water. Dr. Davis, you talked a bit about your childhood, and you've sort of touched on various people that have been integral to researching what is happening with the environment and health problems. Maybe you could talk a bit about your transition into the world of epidemiology, what you found in your early research versus what you're finding now, and what direction are we going? Are there any improvements? Is it all bad news?
Oh, first of all, it's not all bad news. I mean, look who's here. And my book, as you know, has received some attention. I just got a nice review in Scientific American I learned of just today. But beyond the personal interest and attention to the book, there are growing numbers of researchers all over the world today who have been able to confirm the importance of what we know about current levels of air pollution in the United States, as well as levels that are higher and more worrisome in developing countries. My own transition, you asked about, I think I grew up, like most of my generation, believing that your health was your own responsibility. That sort of Calvinist Protestant notion that, if you got sick, it was your fault. And I began to become aware, as I looked at the patterns that occurred in my family and with others that I knew, that there was a lot of health problems that we couldn't explain by individual responsibility, that a person could not drink, exercise, not smoke, take good care of themselves, and still end up ill, particularly working with women with breast cancer, and especially those who develop the disease at a young age. It became clear to me that the individual approach, while it is important, was not sufficient. And the problem that we have in our society is that we are such an individually based society of people accepting individual responsibility, that the concept of social responsibility for our health and welfare is a much more difficult one for people to accept on a fundamental level because of our basic belief systems and the Judeo-Protestant tradition and the notion of responsibility. So what I was able to see as I started to look at these patterns of the diseases that could not be explained was that there had to be other things going on in the environment that were important. At this point now, we really have more than 6,000 different studies, some of them done by leading researchers here at Harvard and elsewhere, that make it clear that current levels of air pollution are a problem for our health today and that we can do something about it with current technologies. We also have made progress when it comes to understanding workplace hazards. not only the hazards of working with dangerous processes, such as those that were documented recently in the New York Times in the series by Lowell Bergman, showing inspection violations and safety problems, but problems with exposure to toxic chemicals in the workplace. So we have made progress in the science, and I think we're in a better place in terms of the science now than we used to be. But I wrote my book because I think the science itself can be so dauntingly complex that we have to understand it, we have to explain it in a way people can take action on.
What are the barriers to having that science explained and the agencies that are set up that make it difficult to get that information out or to make policy changes?
Well, the first barrier is in part cultural, this tradition of individual responsibility, which we all have to acknowledge. And a subset of that, if you think about it, is when you are sick, you go to a doctor as an individual and he treats your body and he looks at some cells or organs or tissues from you as an individual. You don't go to someone who looks at your community as a whole and says, wow, we have 10 times more asthma now than we had 30 years ago. Why is that? So the first problem is really cultural, and that is an important barrier. The second problem is educational, professional education as well. The average medical student or health professional gets very, very little education about environmental and workplace factors, or nutrition even, for that matter. So that, again, is part of the problem. There are, however, right now some very real political barriers. And in my book, I document stories of some companies that have behaved really badly in the past and may still be doing so because, of course, I can't document that right now, and have done things like kept lead in gasoline far longer than we should have, and seen that evidence on the hazards of acid aerosols was discredited and not allowed to come into play for a lot longer than it should have. So those are the problems that we face now. And this administration is embarked on an effort to manipulate science in a way that has not been seen since the first Reagan administration or perhaps the time of McCarthy. And I think we all need to be very deeply concerned about the misunderstanding of science. They're giving a whole new meaning to the term crackpot science.
You are listening to Devra Davis discussing When Smoke Ran Like Water. The floor is now open to the audience for questions and comments. Please line up at the microphone. Go ahead, sir.
Yes. May I now address? A couple of years ago, the Union of Concerned Scientists, after an exhaustive study that you may very well know about, determined that of the large pollution sources dispoliating our environment and world, the first is due to the automobile, the oil consumption, etc. Second to that, they said, was industrial agriculture, factory farming, the way in which we eat and grow our foods. And I notice by its absence, not only in your talk, but in many environmental groups who are, I think, very much and very properly concerned with this problem, that food, factory farming, and industrial agriculture does not come up to salience level.
That's a very good point that you're making, and in my next book, but you're raising a very, very important set of issues. Let me assure you, in the large-scale agriculture has major effects on our water, on our air, on our soil, and it is something that I think really deserves attention. I'm actually a little concerned. Some of the public discussion on GMO focuses only on GMO as though that's the only problem. I think there are a lot of really big problems with agriculture, and one of them is this. We ban pesticides in the United States, and then we sometimes still produce them and ship them to other countries. When you buy those beautiful flowers that we get now increasingly, they come from Latin American floriculture, And they contain pesticides that we ban in the United States, that the women and children who are harvesting them are exposed to in greenhouses with no protective equipment whatsoever. Those polar bears I talked to you about, they're showing up with residues of pesticides that have been banned for years in the United States. They don't go working in factories or farms. They're getting exposed because there's a global circulation and distillation of pesticides that get used in the tropics that volatilize into the atmosphere, get transported throughout the globe, rain down, particularly at the polar ice caps, get into smaller animals and move up the food chain. So this is a very, very important problem, and I thank you for bringing my attention to it.
But there was a sort of an answer.
Sir, I'm going to ask you to use the microphone.
Why were the other organizations, the environmental ones,
If you want to go to the mic and ask. The question that he's asking.
But the ancillary question is, what you said is so, but I see too often environmental groups that do not focus on the food industrialization, factory farming aspect. Why do they not tackle it as part of their domain? It seems to be kept separate.
Yeah, that's, again, a good question, which I cannot answer except that, a variation on Mae West, so many problems, so little time. They have to figure out what they can focus on. And right now, for all of us, I think that's a very important thing to think about. There are things happening in the world today that we may not like, that we can't do anything about. So it's important to understand what you can focus on and concentrate on that. But you're raising very, very good points. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. First of all, I was very impressed by your lecture. But I want to make a couple of points that maybe are my points, maybe are extreme, but have to do a little bit with what the gentleman noticed. In the beginning, you were very moving when you described the Holocaust, your family, everything that they experienced. And then you went further to describe what happened in your town in Pennsylvania. And then you said, well, I can't compare the two because one thing was meant by humans that wanted to destroy blah, 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 and the other was because they wanted to produce and work and so on. Now, I disagree 100% because I think that there is absolutely no difference because those things were not meant to produce and give people happiness and labor. I think from the beginning, the industrialized society had the purposes that were to enslave, to take advantage, and to make people sick. And not in this country. But if you think of England, you know very well what happened with tuberculosis, with all the factories there. But if you think of today, it's the exact same thing. Or the sweatshops, and you said now we have high tech, and we check. What do we check? How about the tobacco companies?
Right.
But more than that, how about all these epidemics? You're an epidemiologist. When I was young, we had exterminated malaria, we had exterminated cholera, we had. And now they are coming back with vengeance. Why? It's not just the beautiful flowers in South America.
Right.
And then you mentioned Bella. Well, I think Bella would have worn today a bigger hat because, she would be invisible today, even with the big hat that she was wearing and even with her deep voice.
Yeah.
Because I think we are really blinder today than we were.
Well, there are different ways of looking at these problems. I appreciate your point of view. I don't agree with it completely. Let me just say this. We're here in a modern society today. People are living longer and better in many sectors of our society. Poor people still are not. And the recent decision on the Senate not to support expanding health benefits for pregnant women, I think, is an abomination, and I'm very concerned about the denial of basic treatment to so many people in our society. Having said that, I think at the same time we have to acknowledge that we have progress in some sectors of the world today, that we have laws that are not always well enforced to protect workers, that things are better than they have been, but they're not as good as they need to be. And so that's why what I would say with all due respect is, yes, the Industrial Revolution did involve death and disease for millions of workers whose lives were sacrificed. There's no question about it. Things, in my view, are better than they used to be, but not as good as they need to be. Thank you.
Hi. I guess I just have to rebut a little bit. This wasn't what I was going to talk about, but I think people do get a little distracted because things are better here in this country. But I have to agree with the previous woman that in other parts of the world, our lifestyle is really creating a lot of death and destruction and environmental harm and enslavement and all of that. So while I agree things are better in what, in the Western type of world, we're getting cleaner and better, it's not happening everywhere. So I just want to make that point.
And of course that's correct.
However, what I came up here to ask about was, as a woman, I'm deeply concerned about breast cancer and the great increase in that, and I'm wondering if you have really any true hope that it will ever be linked to environmental causes. It seems like the whole healthcare system is set up for screening and going in there and treatment, and there's just so much dollars behind that, and there's virtually nothing to support studies to look at other types of causes, and I'm wondering what you have to say about that.
Well, and I appreciate your concern and share them. And again, I guess, I have to confess, I live in Washington and I'm a Jew. Now, at this point in the world's history, you probably can't do either of those things without being an optimist. Because it's otherwise would be almost an unlivable situation. So I prefer to be an optimist because it's easier to live that way than to live in despair. But I understand the reasons that you're expressing your concerns, and I share those concerns. I do believe we understand a lot more about breast cancer now in the environment. In my book, I have a chapter, The New Sisterhood of Breast Cancer, which explains why we do know now that the environment does contribute to breast cancer, even though the human studies have been inconclusive. We have to acknowledge that. The human studies on breast cancer in the environment have not demonstrated clearly an excess from the environment in women yet. But workplace studies show it. Women workers who work with certain plastics, with certain fuels, with certain hydrocarbons, with certain solvents, they have increased risks of breast cancer. This cuts to the core of the question of how do you know that X causes Y? What kind of evidence can you rely on? My perspective is we've got to shift the discussion away from, can we prove that your cancer was caused by your exposure to that thing? Shift the discussion away from that to a discussion of what are the chemicals and other things in the environment that we have good scientific grounds for believing will increase the chance that you'll get breast cancer. And stop saying we have to wait until we have conclusive proof of sick or dead people before we take action. If you agree with that concept, which the Silent Spring Institute has endorsed, which the Breast Cancer Fund has endorsed, which Breast Cancer Action and other groups have endorsed, and references in my book and on my website can be found to all of those. If you agree with that view, then we don't keep saying, well, can we prove these people are sick, but rather we say, can we reduce our exposure while we continue to try to resolve the issue with scientific research? I always want to see more scientific research. It keeps scientists employed. It's important. It's really important. But we have to stop being confused by saying that we don't have proof and therefore we should do nothing, because doing nothing means doing something. It means keeping things going as they are. And what we do know is that there are a number of plastics and fuels and pesticides which, if you give them to breast cancer cells in a petri dish, you can accelerate their growth. That work has been done by researchers at Tufts University, Anna Soto, and Carlos Sonnenschein. It's been known for more than a decade. We also know that there are good and bad hormones from work that I've done with colleagues at Rockefeller and Cornell, and that the total amount of the hormones a woman's exposed to in her lifetime increases her risk of breast cancer. We know that hormone replacement therapy increases your risk of breast cancer. We know that daughters of women who were given DES to prevent miscarriage in the first trimester of pregnancy are showing up with an increased rate of breast cancer when they're 40 years old. Think about this. A small exposure for a few weeks early in pregnancy affects the risk of developing cancer in an adult 40 years later. That's a very important finding, and it says to me we can stop insisting that we should do nothing while we wait for more proof, because we've got enough of that kind of evidence at this time. So
I truly believe in the motto on the mural across the street, and I see it regularly. What can we do to ensure that this emerging knowledge is acted upon?
Work with the Women's Community Cancer Project, work with groups, the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition. There are groups here in Massachusetts who share your views. And let me say something else, that your point about the developing countries. The most difficult sessions I attended when I was a delegate to the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg were the sessions with the grandmothers of orphaned HIV children whose parents had died, and some of these women had walked to the meeting in Johannesburg. And their message is a very grim one. They come from areas of Africa where life expectancy is dropping, where the economy is dropping. And you're absolutely right. It is a terrible situation, and we have a moral obligation to help those who are suffering in this fashion, and to come up with ways to do it efficiently, which may sound somewhat cruel and unusual as a term for me to use, but if we're not efficient, we can waste a lot of money and a lot of broken hearts of trying to solve this problem in an inefficient way and not make any headway at all. So you're absolutely right. Many people in a number of areas of this planet are suffering, and we have an obligation to help them as well. Thank you.
Yes, a number of environmental policymakers talk about a sustainable economy where business interests and economic interests find common ground with environmental interests as well. And I'm just wondering if you have much faith in that notion. Do you think that just based on a number of the studies that you have in your book where you look at how economic self-interest has led to pollution and contamination, it seems that that's sort of a gloomy story. So I'm just wondering if you have much faith in that area, and how a sustainable economy might be able to address issues of contamination, dealing with hormone contamination, things like that. Mm-hmm.
Well, I am a person of great faith, as may be obvious from the fact that I took on writing this book, and in it I discuss the stories that I learned from rabbis when I was very young, and one of them I will mention to you here, that a group of people are told to complete a task, and they say, "We can't do this. We don't have the right tools. It's impossible. Forget it." And the answer the rabbi gives is, it's not for you to finish the job, but you must begin it. So that's an important motto for me that I think of often, because I recognize that some of these issues I will not see the results completed. Having said that, I do think that there are some people in the business community and in the faith-based communities who are trying really to do the right thing. And for all of the bad guys out there, and there are a number of them, and I talk about them, there seem to be a growing number of people in the business community who are making a commitment to doing the right thing. There's something called ISO 14000, the International Standards Organization 14,000, which has articulated a number of principles that businesses have to commit to following in order to be called a sustainable business. BP claims to be an environmentally sensitive company because they say that BP is going to stand for Beyond Petroleum. Now, in truth, they spend more money telling you about that than they do actually doing something about it, but I think it's a good move. And I think that it's a sign, at least, that they understand that they've got to change the rhetoric, and I think the public has to step up. And Bella had an idea at one point that I think was always a good one. She said we need girl cots. We have boycotts, but boycotts is you say no. Girl cots, women all over the world buy things for their homes, right? Well, you look under your sink, look in your bathrooms, look at your cosmetics, and read the labels, and buy things that you are more confident in are not based on toxic materials. And if you don't know what they are, then work with local groups to find out and make sure that we have answers to those questions. And I'm talking now to some businesses who are interested in doing those things, and I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, and you can go to and buy products that are made that are chlorine-free and less toxic nowadays. And I think with girl cots and buying things that are healthier, there's even a revolution now, for goodness sakes, with Girl Scout cookies and candy sales in schools. I never thought I'd see that day. It was always a source of great dismay to me when my children would come home from school and we had to sell candy. And I said, no, I don't want to sell candy. I'll give them a donation. Well, they're even moving now to sell greener things for fundraising for schools. So I'm encouraged, and I think we all have to work to make things like that happen and to see that these companies that claim to be green really are. When I was at Earth Day 2000, I said the environmentalists there were a little bit like the dog that caught the family car, had been chasing it for years and years, and then finally had the car right in their grasp and didn't know what to do with it. Because there were all of these companies that were saying, we're green, we're green. But what does it mean? I think that's up to us to make sure that those definitions are made clear and that we move together to see that business makes money doing better and makes less dirty environments for all of us. Thanks.
My name is Rita Arditi, and I'm a member of the Women's Community Cancer Project, which is the project that sponsored the mural that is across the street. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is the mural, and you can see it when you walk out of the church just to the right and across.
Right. Maybe you hold it open so the camera can try to get a picture of it.
This is the mural that Devra described, and she is there sitting next to Bella Abzug. Here are the 12 women activists that died prematurely of cancer. Rachel Carson, it's here. And this is activism that we, those of us who have cancer but who are still alive, are doing in Washington. Our motto is, Rachel Carson was right. And here are the toxic pollutants that are responsible, we believe, for the problem. I brought these two copies of the poster to give to Deborah. And what I wanted to say is that our group focuses on the issues of health and the environment, particularly cancer, and of course breast cancer is one of our priorities. And we are members of a statewide coalition called the Alliance for a Healthy Tomorrow. The Alliance for a Healthy Tomorrow is a coalition of environmental groups, women's group, public health group, environmental health and physicians, and the priorities of this alliance, of this coalition, is to introduce legislation in Massachusetts that incorporates the precautionary principle, the thing that Devra was talking about, of stopping disease before it starts. We believe we have to stop cancer before it starts. Once you have it, it's too late. And this coalition is focusing on cancer, asthma, and learning disabilities in children, which we know now are in great part also environmentally induced. Just today I was in the State House lobbying senators about these laws that we want passed, and I want to mention them so that you have an opportunity to also put pressure. The Act for Healthy Massachusetts, which is legislation that will focus on 10 particularly bad chemicals that are all over the place, legislation pertaining to cosmetics and household cleaners, like she was mentioning, and others, and it's a whole package, mercury reduction, and we really are committed to make this legislation a model in the nation, and from there to the rest of the country. So all of you who are interested in improving environmental health issues in Massachusetts can contribute it by supporting the Alliance for a Healthy Tomorrow.
Which has a website.
And also the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, our group, the Women's Community Cancer Projects, and many others. So if anybody is interested in learning more about it, please talk to me at the end. But as Devra pointed out, the websites for all these groups exist and offer the opportunity to really do something.
Thank you, Rita.
As people move from a farming and fishing society to a capitalism, industrial society, people cause more pollution. Do you think there's going to be a population drop in the future, and the life expectancy will drop with more people working in the capitalist way of life?
Well, it's interesting you say capitalism. Let me tell you that in 1970, when Earth Day was held, Mao Zedong said the Chinese didn't need to attend because under communism there could be no pollution. And we understand that, of course, communism, as it was practiced under Mao, was devastating for people's lives as well as for the land. And they had these huge, massive farming activities. They drained lakes. The Aral Sea, a project was started that basically took the largest inland lake in the world and emptied it in order to create massive amounts of cotton manufacture. Now, I say this not because I'm a red-baiting anti-communist person, but because I think that it's not just capitalism that's the problem. It's the whole attitude and relationship to the earth that is the problem. There are those like Amory Lovins who talk about natural capitalism. And by that, he refers to a sustainable relationship with the resources, so that one is trying, if you will, to have a smaller fingerprint or footprint on the land. So, as an example, the country of the Netherlands right now geographically uses 200 times more land space than it occupies for the resources that it needs. So I think that there are problems with the way that our economy is organized, for sure. I don't think that capitalism quite summarizes what the problems are, because we have subsidies for certain big extractive industries. That's not capitalism. That's a form, I guess, almost of socialism. And we have perhaps working poor might have capitalism to live with. But the issue you asked about population is the single most important driver or determinant of the state of the world that we have today. And there are areas of the world where life expectancy is dropping. They are in the former Soviet Union, in some of the towns that were used to manufacture weapons and chemical weapons and radiation, like Magnitogorsk. And there are areas of sub-Saharan Africa that I alluded to where life expectancy is dropping as well. And frankly, it doesn't have that much to do with the economy alone. It has to do with a whole set of attitudes and relationships that people bring to understanding how they are connected to this earth. I think the lessons of space exploration make it very clear that we only have one planet. And I think we've got a couple billion years left, at least. And so the question becomes, how do we use the resources on this planet in a more wise fashion? And there are efforts underway by programs like the Natural Step, groups in Europe that are trying to practice Factor 10, which is to reduce the amount of waste dramatically. My colleague, Dr. Terry Collins at Carnegie Mellon University, is pioneering in what is called green chemistry, where they're actually making products out of plants instead of out of petrochemical feedstocks. Think for a minute, what if we didn't need oil for our cars or for a lot of our synthetic chemicals? How different the world might look right now in terms of the geopolitical chessboard. So I think there are a lot of things we need to do, and I'm not sure that capitalism alone either is or is not a big part of the problem. Right.
Hi. I just have an announcement. MassPIRG, it's a public interest research group. MassPIRG is also working to reduce air pollution and whatnot. And I know for certain that there is a public hearing on Tuesday, March 18th. It's at the State House at 9:30 in the morning to discuss the legislation about cleaning up some of the power plants in the state. Because I think there's 5 or 6 power plants in the state that are emitting mercury and other pollutants. So you can check out masspirg.org.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Spengler, do you want to add any comments on the power plants in Massachusetts? Yes, and the proposal at a hearing that is coming up March 12th to discuss proposals to limit emissions. I am honored to introduce Professor Jack Spengler from Harvard University, who is...
I got out the door before a power plant question got asked.
No, I'm afraid not. And also, he's one of the heroes of my book because 20 years ago, more than that, he and Richard Wilson first warned at that time that emissions from power plants then were a problem, and he has since gone on to confirm that repeatedly with studies with a number of colleagues.
So the question before us is power plant reductions, and I think we conducted an evaluation of emissions from 2 power plants in Massachusetts, as well as we did this in Illinois and around Washington, D.C. And I think it's clear from the analysis is supported by a vast body of work, which you cite in your book and recited here, that particulate pollution from combustion sources have a link to decreased longevity, mortality, respiratory diseases, asthma, and that we now have the ability to quantitate those effects from our existing power plants and other sources. And we also have the ability to look at demand-side management that would lead to benefits if we do reductions. And I think we have before us right in Massachusetts, a political debate over values and whether we should ask all of us who use electricity to pay a fraction of pennies more to have a cleaner burning plant.
Could you say a little bit more about demand-side management for people who don't know the term?
Demand-side management would be looking at alternatives to reduce the generating demands for electricity. This could range widely from relamping a place like this to home insulation. We have a vast amount of energy to save at about half the kilowatt hour dollar cost for kilowatt hour for conservation that it does to put in new equipment. So that for half the investment, instead of another peaking power plant, diesel or gas turbine, we could be conserving widely. I think we're proud in this state. Our state has the Mass Energy Council to really look at alternative energy systems and aggressively promoting wind and solar and not hydro. They don't have that capability, but looking at alternative green energy sources in the state. And I think we should be proud of what Massachusetts is doing on that.
I thank you very much for that. I would say that the lighting here is certainly, you could save a lot of money really fast by switching these bulbs out. And then the question becomes, what do you do with the old ones? And there are issues involved there, but there are opportunities to save money. You could unscrew every other one for starters. And what Dr. Spengler is making clear is that there's technologies on the shelf now that could be used to radically reduce the demand for energy now. One of the lessons that came out of California's energy crisis, which we now know was largely manufactured, is that people in the state were able to cut their consumption of energy a whole lot in response to that brownouts and blackouts that they experienced. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I'm encouraged, because the private sector, the part of it that's being honest and fair, and there are such people in the private sector today, despite the bad apples we hear about. The private sector does have technologies that can be used now that can remarkably reduce the demand for energy, so that instead of building a new power plant, you reduce the demand for electricity in general. And we will all be better off, because air pollution, as I make clear in the book, has 2 effects. You have the local pollutant effects, which affects all of our health, and you have the buildup of greenhouse gases that is going to be around for a long, long time. Thank you.
Yes. You're probably familiar with Robert Proctor's book, Cancer Wars, in which he takes a dim view of the scientific research on cancer. Not because he finds any of it wrong, he just finds it utterly redundant and wasteful of money and so on. He has a line which has always stuck with me. The call for more research is politically safe. Whenever politicians don't know what to do, they say, well, let's have more research, and they set up another scientific committee.
Right.
One of the things he has said is that we really don't need more research as to what causes cancer, We know very well what causes cancer. We've been giving it to laboratory rats for 25 years. We know just how to produce cancer. What we're suffering from is the lack of political willpower to do anything about it. We don't need more information. That's the point that remained with me from his book.
All right. Well, thank you. Yes, Robert Proctor is a colleague of mine, and I'm certainly familiar with that book and a number of other excellent ones that he's written. However, let me demur. We don't need more of the same old research. In fact, I've talked recently with an editor of a leading journal who said we just don't need another article that does that over and over again. We don't need more of the same, but we do need some new work to be done, and we can make some advances. And we've got to be aware that one of the things that's going on now, and this verges on insider baseball, is that the toxicology evidence that you're referring to in animal studies is itself under some attack, because some of the experts are advising that we can't really be sure that the male rat is very much like a human male, or we can't really generalize from the female mouse to a human. And they're correct. That is absolutely correct. But the problem in the animal study, animal literature we face is this. If you have 100 animals, each one of those animals represents basically 25,000 people in a study, because of the size of the human population. And we have to be very careful to generalize from that animal studies to humans. So while we have a lot of good information now, we can still use some more studies. The problem is we have, as Dr. Proctor has pointed out, we lack the political will to act on what we know now. And that's why I wrote the book, and that's why I'm writing the next, because I think that there's a lot of public support for this. And that's why Rita Arditi and others here with the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, the Women's Community Cancer Project, these are people who have spent decades now working on these issues, and there's more of them now, so I hope you will join in helping to support them in their efforts. The Silent Spring Institute right now really needs some support, because they have produced some very important studies, and with all of the cuts in state funding, as you might imagine, they're getting cut as well. And I'm very concerned about that, because they're at a point now where they've done and created an impressive body of work that it's very important that we get out there. All right. Is there anyone who has not asked a question? Let's see. Okay. Go ahead. Please.
I was very impressed in the beginning when, as an epidemiologist, you said that we have always encountered disease from the individual point of view, not from what we should have done. And this is the history of medicine, actually. And part of it was that the doctor said, hey, you're not going to cut the butter and bread of my children. And part of it was ignorance. But it wasn't just ignorance, because I went to medical school 40 years ago, and that was known already. And nothing was being done. And the reason was exactly what you said, individually always. And this society is known for that. So you said, what do we do? And you explained very well what do we do. And yet, when we are now faced with all these problems, you don't see it in a global sense. And when somebody explains to you, well, we're doing a little better, but how about all these underdeveloped countries that do so much worse? And you say, oh, we'll try, we'll do. When this gentleman behind me says to you, but isn't this just a political issue? Isn't it something we are to expect? And when he said capitalism, you're playing semantics. Now, whether Mao was a communist and desiccated a big lake, and whether, whatever, has nothing to do. We're talking about modern man polluting this planet by creating whatever. Are we going to cause underpopulation, whatever? The hermaphrodites that you noticed, are there only bears, or are we becoming hermaphrodites? And why do we have so much? You say breast cancer. We have all kinds of cancer. Mm-hmm. And we have immunologic,
Right.
Now you know all these things better than me, and they are all political.
I certainly wouldn't deny that there's a lot of political issues behind the pollution patterns that we have today. There's no way I can deny that. Of course it's true. Of course it is. The question is, how do we address it now? And I think one of the first things we have to realize is that democracy, which is the worst form of government except for any other form that's been tried, that democracy rests on an informed public. We can't be informed when it comes to hazards in the environment that are so complicated. That's why I wrote my book. I wrote my book to create more of an informed public, so people would understand that when you take a plant and shut it down in Washington State and ship it to Mexico, you're not solving any problem at all. What you're doing is you're making it worse in two areas. You're taking people and taking them out of jobs in Washington State, and you're poisoning people in Mexico, and you're calling it progress. That's no progress, and I certainly understand that. What we need, however, is a soft revolution in public understanding of science and the environment. And we haven't had that. In part, the problem has been that the science is complicated, but it's not that complicated. And that's why I wrote the book. And that's why I'm glad to be here and talk with you about this, and we can argue as long as you like. Capitalism may or may not be the right system. I don't know where it exists. My point is it doesn't exist. You know, we don't have it here either. It's not that capitalism itself is inherently the problem. It's the way we treat the resources of the world right now that's the problem. And I'm not sure, and I frankly am not an expert on economic systems to know what sort of system would work better, but the one we have is not working well when it comes to protecting the environment. That's no question about it.
Doctor, you mentioned PCB. New Bedford Harbor has a big problem with that. We haven't heard lately from the news reporters about the PCB problem in the world.
Well, yeah, PCBs are a continuing problem. They've been shown to be associated with developmental delays and learning disabilities in children. And the amount of PCBs a woman was exposed to affects her children's ability to learn when they're 6 or 7 years older. So we know it's a serious problem.
What are PCPs?
Polychlorinated biphenyls, which were industrial materials that were used in capacitors, fireproofing, and in electrical switching boxes, and unfortunately have been dumped into Bedford Harbor and Newark Harbor and the Hudson River and a lot of places that they have been found. Yes, sir.
Devra, you made the observation, even charge, that the Bush administration is playing fast and loose with the scientific facts. And I can't let you let the program end with respect to our live and listening audience without, and I believe the same thing, but if you would kindly provide an example, 2 or 3, of why and where that's happening. Thanks.
Okay. The Bush administration has removed members of the Advisory Committee for the Centers for Disease Control panel on lead poisoning in children. In my book, I talk about lead and how long we have known its harmful effects to children, and the role that George Will and Ronald Reagan played finally getting lead out of gasoline some 50 years later than they should have because of the effects that industry was able to engage in to keep it in gasoline. And one of the things this administration did was to remove people who are experts on lead poisoning from the CDC Advisory Committee and replace them with people who have testified in other cases against Aaron Brockovich, yes, the Aaron Brockovich, and who have testified that the level of lead that a person can be safely exposed to is 7 times higher than the current government level. Another committee that they have affected is the peer review process at NIH for study sections to look at ergonomics. The Clinton administration spent, I think, more than 5 years developing a standard on workplace safety and design. Any of you who have problems with repetitive motion or weights with backs understand the seriousness of the issue. And the Bush administration under OSHA has taken the position that there is not adequate science on this issue. So these are 2 examples. Unfortunately, there are many others. I've heard from colleagues at the Department of Energy and at EPA that they are not being permitted to speak to the press now without having to go through approval processes. Look, politics is a really rough sport. But this goes far beyond the bounds of anything acceptable and threatens the very basis of our civil society. I said democracy rests on an informed public. It also rests on information freely exchanged. And if you start to impede the exchange of information on these issues, it's going to be a big problem. I thought it was very interesting that OMB is proposing to do an economic analysis of the costs of the loss of privacy that is now about to hit us with all of these new rules and regulations opening up information to the federal government, meaning that there's much less privacy today than we've had before. And so there's a lot going on in the area of information in this administration that's very troubling to people on all sides of the aisle, I should say. This is, I think there's some very questionable policies here that really do need to be fully discussed publicly at this point. The world is in danger now. Nobody would deny that. But what we are doing now may not make it safer.